Hi chess fans, we're looking at the game between Aronian with white and MVL with black played in the Tbilisi World Cup 2017 semifinals. In this video we will look at two opening ideas in the Grunfeld, a positional exercise, a calculation exercise, and an ending with imbalanced material where black is an exchange down but has an extra pawn and is able to draw. So let's have a look at the game. Aronian played d4 and MVL played the Grunfeld after d5. C takes, knight takes, e4, knight takes, b takes, bishop g7. Black tries to get some activity and attack white center. Knight f3, c5, rook b1, castle, bishop e2, takes, and queen a5. Now in this position, the theory move is to play bishop d2, attacking the queen and allowing the queen to take on a2. White is now a pawn down. Now, why does white in this position not play queen to d2? Protecting the pawn and making sure the queen, covering this check. Okay, so in this position, white typically does not play queen d2 because black gets to exchange queens, and in this position, white's center pawns get weak very easily, and black has very easy play against these pawns. So the game could continue with b6, making sure that pawn is not attacked and preparing to develop the bishop. White castles, white has to develop. Bishop b7 is already attacking the pawn on e4, and white has to protect the pawn and react. If white protects the pawn with the bishop, black can immediately attack the pawn on d4. And if that pawn is protected with the bishop, black can play e6, and if white develops knight c6, and you can see that the pawn here is attacked 3 times, and the pawn on e4 is also attacked, so it's already getting very difficult, and white will probably lose one of these pawns. If the pawn after bishop e7 advances, the problem is that these pawns get weaker the more they are advanced. So in this position, black can exchange the light squared bishops and play, for example, f5, attacking the base of the pawn. And the point is that if takes, this pawn gets super weak. And the only other option is to advance the pawn. And then black has f4, and one of the pawns will fall. So essentially, the idea is that after queen d2, black does not immediately win this pawn on a2, but black has an easy time attacking these pawns. And this is why Aronian played bishop d2, giving up this pawn, and why this is one of the main lines in the Grunfeld. Okay, game continued, castle, bishop g4, bishop e3, both sides develop their pieces, knight c6. And in this position, again, there are 2 theory moves, and Aronian played d5, advancing the pawns, and second opening lesson, why does white not simply retake this pawn here? So first of all, that is a theory move. It is possible to play rook takes b7. But essentially, black can play rook a b8, and after these rooks are exchanged, look at this position. The material is equal. White has won back this pawn, but actually black has pretty active pieces. This bishop, of course, is a monster bishop. This bishop, together with this knight, coordinate well against this pawn. And black has the positional resource of pushing this pawn forward. So all of black's pieces look very active. The rook is also very active. All of black's pieces look active, and black has this resource of this passed pawn. So that's why rook takes wins back material, but again, after pretty straightforward moves, black gets a pretty good position. So that's why also in this position, white rather continues playing with d5 and gets activity than winning back the material immediately. Okay, the game continued knight a5, now black is able to protect this pawn, and the idea is to advance this pawn, then bring the knight back in the game. And white plays bishop to g5, attacking the e7 pawn. And now we have a positional exercise. So in this position, MVL played b6, protecting the pawn that was attacked by the rook, and allowing bishop takes. Now, why did black allow this? Why did black not, for example, in this position, play queen a3, protecting this pawn? Well, let's have a look at what happens if black were to play like this. Basically, white has one resource, and this resource is these pawns in the center. And what white wants to do is bring all the pieces behind the pawns and push them forward. And this is a very strong plan. And all of white's pieces basically support this plan. And while white is doing this, because he controls the center, black's pieces have a hard time coordinating. So that's a pretty dangerous plan. And let's have a look. If black were simply to protect the pawn on e7, white can just play with this plan. So play, for example, rook e1, bishop takes, queen d6, black now drops back, while protecting this pawn to play against this plan. Queen e2, making room for the rook, and both the rooks and the queens get behind the pawns. Bishop e5, trying to block the advance. g3, protecting this pawn that was attacked on this diagonal. b6, protecting this pawn. Bishop g4, making room for the f-pawn. Knight b7 tries to come back into the game. Bishop e3, protecting this diagonal from the king. Knight c5, and now f4. And the point is that black cannot take here, because this rook is attacking this bishop is attacking the rook, and the knight is hanging. So bishop g7, e4, queen d8, rook b d1. Again, the queen cannot take here, because rook e d8 would be very strong. Attacking the queen, rook e d8 would be very strong. The queen drops back, and white has the resource bishop to f3, pinning the bishop against the queen. Okay, so going back to this move. So basically, black has to be aware that white has this plan which is very strong. And queen a3 simply doesn't cut it. Queen a3 is not good enough a move against this plan. And let's have a look at why b6 is a better move. b6 allows white to take the pawn here. And have a look at the pawns. It's now 5 pawns against 5 pawns. So black is happy to give up this pawn, basically because he's saying, okay, I cannot stop it anyways. But instead, white has now taken the pawn, and his position has become a little bit unbalanced, and black is now able to take advantage of this. So rook e8 attacks the bishop, and if the bishop moves away, the pawn on e4 is attacked. So for example, if the bishop, moved here, the rook could simply take this pawn. And then all of white's attack is gone. So this move actually invites, and that's what happened in the game, invites white to play d6, but pawns who advance are often weak. And black can attack now the bishop and this pawn with knight c6. And for example, if this pawn here advanced, black is threatening to simply take out this pawn, double the rooks, and black wins. Okay, so very interesting positionally. Rather than protecting the pawn, which is a bit passive, black says, okay, I'm going to get rid of this weakness, and I dare you to take this pawn, because it's going to give me this resource of attacking your bishop and then the pawn behind it. Okay, the game continued d6, knight c6, bishop b5, pinning the knight against the rook. And now MVL played knight takes. And have a look at this position, and let's do a little calculation exercise. Have a look at the candidate moves and calculate what's happening after all of the moves. Okay, there are two obvious moves, d takes e, and bishop takes, okay? So to understand the position, it's useful to just start calculating a few variations. So after d takes e, okay, what can black play? Well, it makes sense to retake with the rook, taking the rook out of the attack of the bishop. And you know, what's going on in this position? So essentially material is equal, but black is one pawn up. And black has these two passed pawns and is simply a healthy pawn up. And white's main resource, which was the two pawns here, is basically gone. So black is much better in this position. So d takes is not possible for white. Okay, what about bishop takes? Okay, in this position, what can black play? Okay, the knight cannot really go anywhere, because let's say the knight goes here, it would be retaken by the bishop. Let's say the knight goes here, it would be taken by this pawn. Let's say the knight goes here, then it blocks the rook taking the bishop. So the only sensible move is rook takes. And if white now plays d takes, we don't want to take with the rook because the queen comes in and kind of crams our pieces here. But essentially, black can drop back with the queen. And how to evaluate this position? Well, white is an exchange up, but black will win back the e7 pawn and has quite some compensation for this pawn, because he has the bishop pair, he has these two pass pawns, and he has 5 pawns against 4 pawns, so he's a pawn up. Okay, so but that's already better for white. But is there something better? Okay, Aronian played h3, attacking this bishop and basically saying, okay, bishop, where do you go? If you go here, then I'm gonna take, and after rook takes, d takes, the queen cannot go here as we've seen in the variation. And on the other hand, if black takes, my queen comes in here and crams the pieces a little bit. So that would certainly be good for white. Okay, the bishop cannot go to e6. Well, if the bishop goes to e7, it's simply taken. If the bishop goes to c8, then it blocks the protection of the rook. So the bishop can't go anywhere, really. If the bishop goes here, we exchange. And yes, the queen can come here, but then we simply win this bishop. Okay, so best is bishop takes. It's more or less forced. And that's what happened in the game. And after queen takes, turns out black cannot do much. Black cannot move this rook away, because then the pawn would take. Black can also not move this knight away, because there's not really a square for the knight and the rook would still be hanging. So the best that black can do is play queen to e6, and after bishop takes, rook takes, d takes, queen takes, we have reached a similar position as in the variation before, just that black has one resource less. Black does not have the bishop pair anymore. So in this position, black is an exchange down and has as compensation these two passed pawns and the extra pawn, but he does not have the bishop pair. So that's the difference why h3 is better than bishop takes immediately. It basically improves the variation by forcing an exchange of one of the bishops before going in for the kill, because black cannot do much here. Okay. So, the game continued rook fd8, and let's have a look at this position. MVL played bishop f8, but there was also the opportunity to win this pawn. And why? Let's analyze this position, because it simplifies a little bit. Why is this an easy draw for both sides? So black is an exchange down, but in exchange he has these two passed pawns. Why is this ending drawn easily for both sides? And MVL didn't go for it. So what's the drawing plan for black and what's the drawing plan for white? That's our ending exercise in this video. Okay, so first of all, with these two rooks being so active and the king tucked in here, white will win one of those pawns. So after white has won one of those pawns, he will be able to activate his king and bring it in to stop the other pawn. So that's the way for white to draw. But can white win? Because he's an exchange up. No, white cannot win, because even if black only has one pawn, he can simply protect this pawn with the bishop, and the white king and rook will always be bound to defend this pawn. And there's no way for white to win. On the other hand, black cannot really win, because white will win one of these pawns. So let's have a look. Maybe that's a bit like too theoretical, but let's just calculate some variations. So rook d8, attacking the king, and the bishop has to go in between. Okay, that's pretty clear. And immediately white can attack one of these pawns. So that's basically the way that white will win one of these pawns. It's a very straightforward plan. Okay, the rook can maybe protect this pawn, but then white can attack the pawn with the other rook. The pawn can advance. We chase the other pawn. Black can protect it again, but after rook b1, the game is basically over for one of the pawns. The best thing that black can do is to start pushing the other pawn. And we already see the motive. We want to bring this pawn to a square where it's protected by the bishop. And that's basically the drawing plan. White takes this pawn, and black doesn't want to exchange here. Because now white has a clear plan of bringing in the king, but also this ending would be drawn. But it's even easier for black if he leaves one of the rooks on the game. But now white first immobilizes this bishop. Black pushes the bishop to the safe square where it's protected, the pawn where it's protected by the bishop. Rook a8, making sure the pawn cannot advance anymore. King g7, unpinning the king. And white goes and activates his king. Now black has the opportunity to get some play against the f2 pawn. And white does not want to advance this pawn because it would allow black to get some play on the dark squares and totally cage in the king. The king cannot get out anymore. Already there's threats with a2 and promoting the pawn. Rather, the king has to get some activity, even if it means losing the pawn. But now, essentially, the king is close enough to help stop this pawn. And white can now simply exchange one of the rooks, and the position is drawn. Even if black has an extra pawn on the king side, the king just approaches, harasses this bishop, and then just stays around to stop this pawn. And the king and the rook make sure that this black king doesn't get out, and the game is drawn. So this is basically the drawing plans for both sides in a position like this. So if you're on exchange down, having one passed pawn on the other side of the board will give you a draw. Okay, with this learning in mind, we can maybe understand why MVL played bishop f8. He wants to keep the queens on the board and get some play, because he's trying to argue, okay, I got these two passed pawns and they are more valuable than your exchange. Well, now he did play queen takes, but white also says, okay, let's continue playing a little bit, just because the game is such an easy draw after the queens are exchanged. Queen b4, queen a1, attacking the pawn, winning one of the pawns, but then black again gets some play against the f2 pawn, and after queen b7, queen e2, rook f1, the players agree to draw, because basically the queens are going to jump around. But once the queens get exchanged, we have this drawn position where the pass pawn compensates for the exchange down. Okay, I hope you learned a lot for a practical game. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.